I received a request from a friend of mine who is deployed in a remote region of Iraq, serving as the senior corpsman for the MARSOC team. The events are concerning a staff sergeant who was found dead after going AWOL. They uncovered a letter written to a friend of his concerning the events that led to his AWOL status and eventual death. My friend asked me to assist in reviewing the letter, as well as witness reports in order to determine the Marine's state of mind. The reports themselves seem pretty straightforward. Nothing but favorable accolades from his peers and superiors. But each had noted that his character began to deteriorate between the stress of a long deployment and the revelation that his wife intended to leave him. While the reports aim to paint a broad picture of this Marine, it's the letter that shows a deeper dive into his mind. I will read the letter exactly as written, omitting only names and operational details in the interest of OPSEC. John, it's funny, brother. The story starts with a letter and now ends with a letter. It's fitting in a way. Life is not without its petty ironies. So, redacted, sent me a letter about a month ago. She explained that she couldn't do the deployment stuff anymore, being a lonely housewife, waiting on me to come home after leaving constantly and blah blah blah. So, she's sucking somebody else off, taking the kids and leaving with half of everything I've earned for us. It's hell of a fine way to keep me motivated to stay alive in a hot zone. I didn't take it too well. I have lost 7 brothers to mortars and IEDs this deployment, on top of now losing my family because deployments were hard on my wife. Are you kidding me? In between fits of crying and fits of rage, I wasn't able to get any sleep. I mean none. No naps, no pass-outs from exhaustion, nothing. I spent as much time as I could trying to kick my ass in the gym and wear myself out, but it didn't help. Literally, I got maybe 3 hours of sleep that whole month. It got so bad that the unusually a-hole Master Guns pulled me aside to make sure that I wasn't cracking up. He referred me to chaps and the corpsmen, but being that sleeping pills is a one-way ticket home and I had no home to go to, I told him that I would figure another way out of this. I had made friends with one of the TCNs named Muhammad that cooked at the DFAC here, and he took notice of what was happening to me. Cigarettes are currency here, so I make sure to take care of the guys who take care of us, you know. In case one of them decides to go all Aloha snack bar on us, maybe he'll decide to spare the infidel that hooked him up with Marlboros. Anyways, he comes by the living area one day with an old wooden box and tells me in broken English that he brought something that will help me sleep. Opening this box, there was an Arabic-looking tea set, and a dozen bags of some sort of herb tea concoction, a recipe that he tells me has been a part of his tribe for many generations. Whatever, right? At this point, one is ready to try anything. I tell him that I just wish that I could frickin' sleep. He tells me, no wish, just sleep. No dream, sleep only. No wish, okay? Just sleep. Okay, man, I said. Whatever will make me sleep. He showed me the very specific way to prepare the tea, involving a chant in whatever variant of Durka his tribe spoke, how long to let the water boil, how long to let the tea steep, and how much to make. He took care to repeat his little chant several times until he was sure that I had it down. He was very insistent on making sure everything was just so. When I asked him what the big deal was, he told me, make safe, sleep only, no dream. It was some witch doctor stuff, I thought, but whatever. I would blow a goat at this point if it meant that I would get a solid 8 hours of rest. I drank 1 cup of tea after Muhammad left, and I climbed to my bunk, expecting to stare at the ceiling until sunrise, as usual. But the next thing I know, it's daytime. I literally close my eyes for a second and sleep so soundly and completely that it's freaking past noon by the time that I come to. Master Guns decided that, given these circumstances, he would let my absence slide. In fact, he hooked me up with a 72-hour sick chit so I could basically catch up on 30 days worth of Z's. I didn't decline. I spent the rest of the day in bed, lazily slipping in and out of cat naps until about an hour or so before sundown. As Muhammad instructed, I made the tea, did the chanting, and finished the tea just as the sun set behind the horizon. Once again, I was out like Ronda Rousey, and I didn't come around again until the afternoon. I was beginning to feel like my old self again. And more than that, I was beginning to have an appetite again. The second day, it had occurred to me that my caloric intake had dropped over the past month, from normal to barely even eating, and my stomach was making it agonizingly evident. I spent far longer than normal in the DFAC and ate 3 trays worth of chow. I walked out stuffed and noticed that the sun was lower than it ought to be for this little tea ritual that I had been doing. But whatever, I thought. It's just tea. I don't believe in God, let alone Arab voodoo, or whatever the heck it was. I got back to my living area and hastily made my tea, thinking that it was more important to stick to the sleep schedule than the hocus-pocus aspect of the whole thing. I boiled the water, skipped the chant, and quickly poured the tea. I only let it steep for a few minutes before downing the hot liquid, well after sunset. I hit my rack and I prepared for another night of complete blackout sleep. But for the first time in well over a month, I dreamed. I think in all of my 30+ years, I can actually remember maybe a dozen dreams that I've had, and not in any complete detail either. As for lucid dreams, I can't recall any. Nothing, man. But nothing can compare to the reality of this dream. It was visceral and all-encompassing. From the shadows cast by the sun, the way the trees and flowers in the park moved, from the minute sounds along the park trail I was walking, the smell of early spring air. It was more vivid than reality, and yet, despite its familiar atmosphere, it was no setting I can recall seeing in person or in any movie. It was like some pristine Elysian landscape pulled from the ether of my imagination. But even I couldn't believe that my brain could conceive such a thing. As I strolled, skylarking at the spring blooms and waterfowl waiting in the pond, a small trickle of people walked past me, quietly ambling or talking quietly in pairs, enjoying the serenity and solidarity with me. We paid each other no mind, and I was only vaguely aware of their presence as I continued the path along the trail, bordering the wooded park and the glass-like pond. I remember distinctively looking at a small bunch of blossoms on a nearby tree when, for the first time, my attention was completely diverted to a figure walking towards me. She was maybe 20 paces out by the time that I had registered her in my peripheral. But once my eyes had locked on her, the previously picture-perfect scenery faded into a nondescript outline. It was like looking at a goddess in her kingdom. Tall for a woman, she wore a flowing, mid-length sundress that was a stark white against her olive, bronze skin. Her hair was thick, black, and flowing in waves like the mane of an Arabian thoroughbred suspended in liquid. The soft, melodic tingling of her ankle bracelets could be heard as she padded barefoot across the naked earth, and I became acutely aware that my jaw was touching my chest right about the time she turned her polished emerald eyes to me and locked in. Her garnet red lips parted, revealing ivory teeth, and a smile that was sweeter than honeysuckle, and my heart pounded with such intensity that an African tribe could dance to it. And then close enough to reach out and touch, she gave me a look while swishing her hips that smoldered like my own funeral pyre. That look made every part of me explode like the 1812 overture, and I felt it insanely difficult to remember that breathing was a basic necessity of life. Our gaze stayed locked as she passed by me, and I smelled orange blossoms wafting from her. I couldn't help myself. I stayed transfixed, locked eye to eye so hard that it drew me through magnetic forest to turn slowly on my heels until she had passed far enough to break our gaze and walk by. when she turned her head back over her shoulder to shoot me one more look. I felt like I had been hit by every bit of electrical energy that had ever existed. As the scent of orange blossoms and the soft jingle of her ankle bracelets trailed by, I stood there with probably the stupidest look on my face, watching her form melt away into the ether of the surroundings, which were slowly regaining their substance. I woke up shortly after that, sweating, heart thundering, and so rock hard that I could spear hunt with it. I stayed that way for hours, and even after the pounding in my heart subsided, the pinning in my heart remained. I could not get that scene out of my head. It was in a loop all day. I couldn't focus or think, or even communicate for the rest of the waking day. It was so intense. All I wanted to do was go back to sleep and see that girl again. That goddess. My goddess. The need overpowered everything else, and it was only through great personal effort that I remembered to use the head as opposed to letting nature take its course in my rack. Food also was an afterthought, and I realized that I hadn't eaten yet that day. By then, the DFAC was closed, but I didn't much care. Like a junkie prepping for her fix, I made 2 cups of tea this time, well before sunset, and sort of half figured I could just sleep now so I could wake up early for breakfast. I was lying, of course. All that mattered was my goddess. I had to see her again. As I succumbed to the will of sleep, I found myself back in that same Elysian landscape. Only this time, it was twilight with a warm summer's breeze coming across the pond, and gently swirling the scent of the summer blooms through the air. The soft chirping of frogs and crickets pizzicatoed against the tremulous vibrato of the calm lapping of the pond on the bank, as the dotting of green fireflies danced against the water's reflection, illuminating their color in contrast to the orange crescent moon. The stillness of the pond slowly gave way to rhythmic ripples pushing towards the shoreline, and the smell of orange blossom began to fill my senses. As the ripples came closer, I began to see a form silhouetted by the light of the moon and fireflies. She rose slowly from the water at the edge of the pond, her nakedness gleaming beneath the thin veil of water that trickled down from her, eyes glowing like 1,000 fireflies caught in a jar. Her look radiated sex, and she walked sultrily towards me, ankle bracelets chiming against the twilight orchestra of pond denizens. She pressed herself against me and began to trace an outline of my face with her finger. In a voice like a 3-chord harmony, she asked very simply, "What do you wish for?" Without a moment's hesitation, "You," escaped my lips in a trembling whisper. I will spare you the details here, but what happened next was the most intense and passionate love-making session that I had ever experienced, awake or otherwise. It left me shaking and spent, almost convulsing in post-coital ecstasy as she stood up and pulled away. She faded with the twilight garden, and I awoke covered in sweat, with a huge puddle of spunk gluing my midsection to my sheets. I felt a mix of embarrassment and elation as I rose up to clean myself off. The day was still young, and I only had 1 free day left. The thought of my goddess holding onto me like a hook in a spawning salmon. I ran to the DFAC to grab breakfast, ate quickly, and immediately returned to my hooch and began to prep my tea. 3 cups will do me this time, I thought to myself. I don't know how to explain it, but I found myself falling in love with the woman of my dreams. Literally. I tried to rationalize it as a byproduct of extreme stress combined with extreme depression and extreme sleep deprivation. It wouldn't be a far cry to think that I was cracking up, but as the old adage goes, a crazy person doesn't realize that they're crazy. Forget it, I thought. 1 more sleep tryst. Hell, the explosion I had just experienced was probably because I hadn't purged the tanks in over a month. I'll take this last day in my happy place, dream of my goddess, wake up sticky and move on with my life. I told myself this, but I didn't believe it. Like a teenager driving to their secret crush's house, I had to see her. This need stretched beyond anything else, no matter how I tried to downplay it. And so, I had my 3 cups of tea and prepared to spend the next 20 hours in reverent elation. I found myself in the crisp autumn sunset air, back in the Mesopotamian garden that was the temple to my goddess. Before me sat a pile of soft pillows underneath a silken canopy, which was lined with torches. The path to this altar of pleasure was lined with similar torches, and the warm smell of sandalwood crested the light, cool scent of mint that lay over the glassy pond. I walked to the center of the shrine, where I intended to worship my goddess with waves of moaning pleasure, but I found it to be empty. A stark sadness stabbed me in an instant, but as soon as that icy dagger hit home, it was melted by the velvet honey voice that whispered into my ear. "Do you wish for me, my lover?" She purred into my ear, as the smell of orange blossom filled my senses in rapturous memory. "Yes," I managed to breathe out, as I felt her fingers wrap around my front and caress me. She crossed in front of me, covered only by a sheer veil wrapped across her like a toga. She took me by the hand and, glancing over her shoulder with a look that promised to fulfill my every desire, she led me to the sacred place where I intended to pray at the temple of her body. Much as the previous night, I woke exhausted and with a little bit of a mess. Only this time, I was no longer on free time. I tried in earnest to rally myself and get back into the swing of working, but all I could think about was my goddess. Obsession doesn't even begin to describe what I was doing with. Addiction was a far more accurate word, and I was a goddamn fiend. Fortunately, there was enough work to catch up on that I kept my body busy, if not my mind. Somewhere in the dense fog of my messed up desire for wet dreams, a little spark of reality reminded me that I am in a war zone, and I need to function properly for survival's sake. Whatever it was in that tea was probably some opium. I figured, since that's about the only thing they grow in this region. With that thought, it became clear that the addiction I was having was due to the tea, and not this dream girl that I kept thinking about over and over. I knew that I had to quit the tea and try to go back to normal, no matter how much I pined for that Elysian peace again. With little surprise, I couldn't sleep for crap that night. I tossed and turned, rolled and kicked, jostled, and finally decided to hit the gym at about 2 in the morning to wear myself out. I did that and I whacked off, in hopes that the endorphin release would calm me enough to at least wrangle a catnap that evening. But every time I closed my eyes, I had a deep sense of dread that made me shoot my eyelids up and respond with a fight or flight response, like something was inches from attacking me. At Revel, I finally gave up and I went about the day. Fine, whatever, withdrawals, right? Opium does that stuff to a body, so I figured 3 days tops and I would be good again. With all that sleep that I was getting recently, I figured that I could probably pull 72 hours without any real issues. You know, it's not uncommon to do that here. So, with my mind made up, I decided to hunker down and tough it out. But not before I found Muhammad and figured out what the heck he had given me in that tea. I went to the DFAC that morning and to look for Muhammad, knowing his usual schedule would have him in the back, prepping for the lunch hour by this time. And sure as shit, the old man was there, tending to his work. He looked up at me before I could speak, his face an expression of fear and concern. "You dream," he said. "Yeah, people do that when they sleep. What of it?" "No more tea," he said. "Not safe." "No crap. That opium stuff has got my head all messed up. What did you give to me, Muhammad?" At that, he shook his head and eyed me intensely. "No more tea, not safe," he repeated, and then he went back to his work. Oh crap, I thought. My grand confrontation didn't go on like I had scripted it. I thought for sure I was going to uncover him as some sort of messed up drug dealer. But what kind of dealer tells their customer to stop taking the stuff? With no more answers than I had when I woke up, I shook my head and went off to get ready for the next mission. At this point, I had been up for around 24 hours when we hit our patrol. We were tasked with hitting a suspected hideout for the big-name bomb maker in the region, me and the 5 others on the team. Intel had the guy at home with maybe 1 or 2 armed insurgents in the house, which was fixed in a normal building just inside the city. I was the Overwatch, mostly because they didn't trust me kicking in doors again just yet. It was supposed to be a simple sweep and clear. I was perched up on the building across the way with a clear scope of the front entry and windows, ready to pop any resistance that might try to get the drop on the team. And man, it was messed up from the get-go, and it didn't last more than a few minutes. As the breacher hit the door, the whole thing blew up, ripping him apart and blowing the leg off the number 2 guy. He bled out in seconds. As the other 3 scrambled for cover around the corner, AK fire opened up from the building that I was in. They had been hiding in the very building that I had cleared. Under heavy fire with no cover, the team didn't last more than a few seconds. I figured there were at least 4 gunmen in my building. Realizing that no one had come for me, I shouldered my long gun and got my M4 ready. I figured all the guys were on the floor just below me, so I quietly made my way back down into the building. I did to them what they did to my team in short order, and then I swept the building again. On the ground floor, I found a large pantry cabinet open which had a secret panel leading to an underground tunnel between the 2 buildings. At this point, I was pretty sure nobody was aware of me, so I crept through the tunnel to the other building. It was empty. The bomb maker wasn't home, but a dummy dressed up like him was sitting at a work table. It had some gears and stuff that made it look like its arms were moving, working on something. Figuring the guy was long gone, and that there was no need for these guys to cover the building anymore, I guessed it was mostly safe. I radioed for recovery, and I waited. The ride back to the base was the longest ride of my life, man. No words were exchanged. I knew there would be enough words to be had at the debrief. I can't go into details of it, but it was pretty quickly determined that there was nothing I could have done to prevent the loss. It didn't make it any less messed up though. I went another 2 days without sleeping before I caved in and made more of that tea. For no other reason than to sleep. I could care less about some opium-induced wet dream with how I was right then. So I got Master Gun's blessing one last time, in light of present circumstances, to take a vacation in my rack for a day. So, in the middle of the morning, I made my tea and I set off to sleep. I found myself inside of a sandstone temple, walking through a long, ancient corridor with indecipherable glyphs carved in patterns on the wall. Behind me was only darkness, while the corridor seemed to be lit from the light of the opening 10 yards ahead. For some reason, unlike the other dream places, this one instinctively made me nervous. It didn't have the same feeling as the other dreams. This one had a deep sense of foreboding and dread. Like there was a menace just around the corner, but I couldn't see it. My usual sexual anticipation was muted by my battle sense. I was acutely aware of the same butt-puckering sensation I get before a fast rope descent. But still, I was compelled forward into the chamber in front of me, despite my brain telling my feet to stop moving the heck forward. The corridor gave way to a vast open chamber, so large that I could not see the ceiling. In front of me was a long, wide stone staircase, flanked on each side by a line of fire extending to the top. As I ascended the staircase, I could see that the fire line snaked around the perimeter of the top, which was vacant except for a stone altar, the size of a bed, the legs of which and surrounding floor, covered in the same glyphic writing that seemed to swirl in moving patterns like the movement of a molten rock. Despite the curtain of fire surrounding me as I approached the altar, I shivered. Still drawn by some unknown magnetism, I disrobed, casting my clothes into the fire, and I climbed onto the altar, a mix of calm and apprehensiveness soaking into me. She appeared as a black shadow, walking fluidly through the fire. She wore a shimmering black hooded cloak lined with gold trim and patterns like the glyphs that covered the floor and altar legs. Whether a product of the light or some sort of magic, they also seemed to shift and swirl across the black cloth. Beneath the open robe, I could see that she was totally nude, soft olive skin shimmering like the skin of a snake. Despite myself, I became as hard as a tombstone, and she smoothly glided towards me, her sweet smile now showing a hint of wickedness. She mounted me and drew close to my face, drawing my breath in hers. I tried in vain to hold myself back, to think about baseball stats or something to separate myself from this moment, but it was an exercise in futility. I was hers and she knew it. My brain yelled at my mouth to keep silent, but it was compelled in some animalistic fever to respond when she purred out. "What do you wish for?" "To be yours forever." I felt myself sputter, seemingly in spite of my conscious mind. "Your wish is my command," she purred. She let out a deep moan of satisfaction, the tone of which starting in her usual melodic alto and ending in a deep bass rattle, her head tipping back, and her shoulders rolling as she thrust herself down into me. I could feel her nails sinking into the skin of my thighs deeply, painfully. The sensation of blood running down my leg almost pulled me from my ecstasy. Almost. As she leaned her head back forward, her eyes fixed on me, those perfect, polished emeralds began to shimmer in the light of the fire and turn a deep, ruby color. Her cloak opened, seemingly with a mind of its own, and unfurled itself behind her. It was in this instant that I saw clearly. This was not a cloak, but black velvet wings, spread enormous behind her. Her hood revealed itself to be the hood of a cobra more than the hood of a cloak, and her grin widened unnaturally so, revealing teeth that turned from perfect pearls into the sharp needles of a predator, and I was on the menu. She continued to ride me forcefully. I wasn't able to stop myself from moving with her, despite the horror unfolding before me. The once beautiful woman now leaned her mockery of a face towards mine, and began to draw in a deep, slow breath. I could feel this breath pulling at me, like it was reaching at something deep down within the core of me and drawing it up to the surface, and I could feel the world blackening in around me as it did. I was jolted awake by a thundering crash, the smell of fire and the sounds of sirens going off as mortars ripped through the compound. Disoriented but functioning on a basic survival level, I threw myself off the top of my rack and I crawled beneath it, grabbing my clothes as I did. Quickly pulling my pants over myself from my prone position, I noted the extreme pain as they slipped over my thigh. I grabbed the rest of my battle rattle and began suiting up from under my rack as the mortars subsided. My heart thundering, I slowly started to force myself to calm down. I took a deep breath and I closed my eyes. In a moment, I was back in that terrible place, the she-devil atop me, her eyes wild with hatred and malice as she howled and drew herself back towards my face. I screamed and my eyes shot open. I was still in my dilapidated CLU, half blown to hell. My panic returned and at once, I realized that the very next time that I closed my eyes, I would be back on that altar, feeling my soul getting sucked away. A soldier is taught that panic kills. Well, that lesson left me. I can't explain to you what my full plan was, but it centered around two things. Stay awake and find Muhammad. Some part of me thought that he was the one who put me in this mess, with this thing, and he might be the only one who knows a way out. In the confusion from the mortar attack, I was able to break into the DFAC and load my ruck up with rippets and a few loose packets of caffeine pills, and then make my way out of the compound without anyone being aware that I left. As I ran, I was, I guess, somewhat aware that I had no idea where Muhammad lived, but I knew the direction of his village from the base, as we often did security patrols around to make sure it was free of insurgents. The fact that I didn't know exactly where he lived, it didn't matter. This was a step in the right direction, and I would work out the details later. For now, I had to keep moving, because if I stopped moving, I would fall asleep, and if I fell asleep, well, I just had to keep moving. As I felt my body beginning to tire, I reached into my rucksack and pounded 2 of the 12 rippets, using them to wash down a packet of caffeine pills, and kept going. Fear, adrenaline, and energy drinks kept my body in motion, and as the sun began to rise, I could see the outline of a village on the horizon. I kept driving on, forcing myself forward with my eyes open. Each time I closed them for longer than a second, I could see her shadow over me, lit only by the fire of her ruby eyes. By the time I made it into the village, I was staggering and exhausted, my caffeine and adrenaline high wearing off, and the reality of being up for almost 4 days was sinking in. Raving like a madman, I began to pound on the doors of the village, yelling for Muhammad. I could see people peeking from their windows, scared as the big American continued to pound on unanswered doors, yelling. This went on for some great time as I worked my way to the center of the village, and slumped against the short stone wall of a goat pen, panting and weeping to myself in exhaustion. I slammed 2 more rippets as I heard shuffling footsteps coming up from behind. Afraid that the demon woman was behind me, I whirled around, ready to pitch my half-full can of energy juice at her and run for my life. I stopped myself as my eyes landed on the sympathetic face of Muhammad, the man that I had been searching for. His eyes were kind and his touch on my shoulder gentle as he shook his head slowly. "Too late," he said. "Too late." And he began to pray. I broke down, weeping as the cautious eyes of the villagers peeked out from their hiding places at the madman now crying in their village square as an old man sang prayers. I thought of my dead friends, my dead teammates, and my lost family. In a village full of people, I was totally alone. As Muhammad finished, he put his hand on my shoulder once again. "Friend, goodbye," he said, and with that, he walked back to his home, speaking to the others in Arabic as he waved his hands in a semblance of caution in my direction. Wiping the tears and snot from my face, I gathered my composure in a few ragged breaths. I looked off to the low hills and saw a faint outline of a shepherd's hut, and figured that was as good as a place as any. Like a doomed man to the gallows, I made my walk. And that's where I am now. I've been here for the better part of 2 days. I'm all out of rippets and caffeine pills, and I'm pretty sure they figured out that I'm not dead but missing. I can feel sleep coming on, and I know that once I drift, she'll be there to collect me. I don't want anyone to die on my behalf, searching the desert for me, so I'll send up a flare and nod off. I know I won't wake up this time. She's waiting for me. Who am I to keep a goddess waiting? And there it ends. They found the Marine's body within a few hours after he launched his flare. The search for him not yet in swing. I suppose he didn't want to become the next Bo Bergdahl. My friend tells me that his letter was what had prompted him to reach out to me. Clearly, the man was suffering from the results of the extreme stress of losing his family, his friends, his team, an extended combat deployment, and severe sleep deprivation brought on by anxiety and depression. But still, I can't help but wonder. I can tell from the letter that he wasn't a common grunt. He clearly was expressive in his writing, which means that he must have read some. He is also mentioned as being good with relating to the local people, which means that he must have studied some of the culture. I mention this because, well, the creature he seems to be experiencing is a foothold in the lore of the region. An ancient demon of sorts, the jinn appeared in the Quran, as well as texts as old as the Sumerians. This creature is said to be a thief of souls, often exchanging them for favor or wishes. It's this belief that we Westerners have adopted into the colloquial genie of popular culture, but its history is far more savage. This Marine must have known something about this legend in order to concoct this manifestation in a state of psychosis. This is the general assessment that I put into my official report on the subject. The Marine was suffering from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and when combined with new stressors, such as his spouse leaving and the death of his team, led to an eventual psychotic episode centered around a local bit of lore he must have come into contact with in his relation with the TCNs. Once the initial cycle of sleep deprivation was broken, he began to have intense and favorable dreams. I believe this must be his mind constructing a safe space for him to exist outside of the loss, fear, and danger of the real world. In these dream states, he felt both safe and in the desire of another, two fundamental qualities that had been missing in his waking world, and the main triggers of his condition. Once those dreams were interrupted with the violence, those two spaces, the safety of the dream world and the danger of the real world, became intersected. Thus, he no longer had a safe space of reprieve. This triggered a psychotic episode and led him to go AWOL, where he most likely succumbed to dehydration from the excessive use of energy drinks and caffeine pills. Not being in a rational frame of mind, I do not believe he packed water with him when he left the compound, only diuretics. The extreme stress and resurgence of sleep deprivation, coupled with the dissolution of his constructed safe environment, caused him to make the tragic decision to wander from the compound without being properly equipped for the environment. But still, there is another element that makes me wonder, as crazy as it seems. My friend tells me that when they recovered his corpse, they at first weren't sure it was him. They said he looked as though he had been mummified. His body appeared to be completely drained, nothing but withered skin and skeleton. While the harshness of the region's desert can do that to a corpse in a relatively short time, he had been missing for just 50 hours.